right, so hello and welcome back. So today we're going to be taking a look at the Battle of Wake Island. Last we looked at Pearl Harbor from Baz Battles, so this ought to be interesting. The link to the original video is in the description if you don't want my commentary, which will take a long time. Also, my Band of Brothers reaction first episode is up there. Go click on that card. I would highly recommend you go watch. It's probably some of my best work if I say so myself. All right, well, with all that said, let's get to it.
It's early morning of the 11th of December 1941. Aboard the light cruiser Yubari, Rear Admiral Sadamichi Kajioka holds a final briefing before a planned invasion as his task force steams towards the Wake Atoll, a U.S. military outpost in the western Pacific Ocean. The war has just started, and the powerful Imperial Japanese Navy already inflicted several serious blows, crippling American influence in the region. The upcoming assault of U.S. fortifications on the atoll was to be another striking success for the Japanese armed forces. The struggle for Wake Island is about to begin. It's late September of the year 1941. Pursuing an aggressive expansionist policy, the Empire of Japan prepares to launch an invasion on the lucrative Dutch East Indies and British Malaya in an attempt to overcome the oil embargo imposed by Western powers and, more importantly, gain much coveted economic independence. Yet such a bold plan unsurprisingly came with some uncertainties. Being aware of the close ties between the United Kingdom and the United States, Japanese planners expected the latter to react to any aggression in Southeast Asia and join the war on the Allied side. In order to remedy this potential problem, the Imperial Japanese Navy was tasked with incapacitating the United States Pacific Fleet with a preemptive strike to ease Japan's expansion into the south and subsequent establishment of good defensive positions.
Okay, so that is something that is not usually talked about is what happened around Pearl Harbor. Let's back this up a little bit. So the Japanese plan, I mean, really they had two plans. The army wanted to go north into the Soviet Union to secure resources. Was that going to happen? Probably not. And then the Navy wanted to do Plan South, which was to basically take British Malaya and the Dutch East Indies. Okay, there was massive amounts of oil and rubber here. Everything in the East Indies would have supplied Japan with the resources it needed to wage a long, drawn out war, technically, if they were able to secure it and actually hold it. If they were able to get this and then attack the Americans, piece them out in 6 months, they could actually be an economic empire in Asia. But that's not what's going to happen. However, you will see that this attack will happen around December 7th, 8th, 9th, okay? The attack on December 7th was against the U.S. Pacific Fleet base in Hawaii, okay? While that was going on, they were also attacking other places, such as Wake Island. They were also attacking British Malaya and the Dutch East Indies, okay? And all one fell swoop. That's why they couldn't call off the attack on Pearl Harbor because if the carriers weren't there, right? The carriers weren't there, but the problem was they couldn't call off the attack because everything else revolved around the Japanese Navy striking the U.S. Pacific Fleet at Hawaii. So that's why they weren't able to call it off. Even if they wanted to, everyone else is depending on them to do their jobs. That's why they couldn't do that.
Preemptive strike to ease Japan's expansion into the south and subsequent establishment of good defensive positions. Whilst Japan applied the last polishes to its ambitious plan, the US government didn't dawdle, pulling all diplomatic strings to prevent Japanese expansion. Moreover, the primary base of the US Pacific Fleet was moved to an advanced station at Pearl Harbor Naval Base in Hawaiian territory in the hope of dissuading Japanese expansion plans. On top of that, military bases were built in the Central Pacific territories under American control to strengthen their presence in the region.
Now, these other bases, so again, the Pacific Fleet was based in San Diego, which, that's closer to the mainland. You can do a lot of repair jobs there that you can in Pearl Harbor. But they moved it to Pearl Harbor as basically if you're able to fuel up in Pearl Harbor with ammunition and everything, you're able to strike deeper into the Pacific, basically threatening Japan. Now, Midway, Johnson Atoll, Kingman's Reef, and Palmaya are basically uninhabited islands. There's almost no one on them. However, if you garrison a few hundred people there, and then in the case of Midway, a few hundred people with the air bases there, you are able to basically do reconnaissance around the island. So basically, let Pearl Harbor know that something is coming and also able to defend yourself. So, in theory, if Midway or Johnson or Kingman Reef was attacked, Pearl Harbor could send the Pacific Fleet to go relieve them, and it basically acts as like a little buffer zone. In theory, at least.
One such remote defensive outpost was located on the Wake Atoll, roughly 2,000 miles west of Hawaii and just 600 miles north of the Marshall Islands, being under Japanese control. Construction of military facilities began in early 1941, and by the beginning of December of the same year, more than 1,100 civil construction staff were working on the atoll. But being a military base, almost 450 US Marines, along with several dozen Navy and Army personnel, were also garrisoned on the island. Apart from machine guns and small arms, they were equipped with 6 coastal artillery pieces, 12 anti-aircraft guns, and last but not least, 12 F-4F Wildcat fighter planes. One could imagine that nearly 1,500 hardware-reinforced Marines were sufficient to properly defend a tiny speck of land on the vast Pacific Ocean. Yet Navy Commander Winfield Cunningham, who flew to the island late November to assume overall command, knew that the garrison on the Wake Atoll should be at least 4 times bigger to pose a serious deterrent to the powerful Japanese Navy.
He's actually not wrong there. So, like, just think about this. What are 500 personnel really going to do against a Japanese fleet that's actually sent to take over the island? Yeah, not much. If the 6 coastal artillery guns, I'll already tell you, are already going to be very old, and they are static, and against a ship, it might be able to do something. However, if the ships have carriers, which fun fact they might, they can just bomb the coastal artillery, and then once the coastal artillery is gone, they will simply move in the ships and bombard the garrison until the garrison surrenders. Now, a bigger garrison with more aircraft to basically shoot down incoming aircraft that would try to target the coastal artillery guns could buy you more time. Now, this garrison is kind of just a speed bump in the road. It's really not going to hold up against anything. Like if you send a marine attachment of around 2,000 people, they'll probably take the island in a few days. Not even a few days. It could be a few hours, depending on how small this island is. When it is very small.
Nevertheless, Cunningham got straight to work, giving top priority to finishing the airstrip and defensive fortifications as soon as possible. But in spite of the earnest efforts of the Wake Islands personnel, the war in the Pacific broke out well before they had a chance to complete their duties. Early in the morning of the 8th of December 1941, a radio technician on Wake Island opened daily communications with Hickam Field at Pearl Harbor, on the other side of the international dateline. Yet the initial transmission was distorted and barely intelligible. Something was not right. Soon, renewed attempts to establish communication made it abundantly clear Pearl Harbor was suffering a relentless assault from carrier-based Japanese warplanes. The United States was at war. Within the next hour, Commander Cunningham and Major Devereaux of the United States Marine Corps made hasty preparations for an impending attack. Soldiers scrambled, manning defensive positions and readying anti-aircraft guns. As the Wake Island outpost still lacked proper radar equipment, 4 Wildcats took to the skies and, despite poor visibility, attempted to patrol the area.
Now, you see, their radar was insufficient or basically didn't have any. Now, that is kind of pretty bad. Mainly because if you're going to use these islands as basically a picket for Pearl Harbor, Pearl Harbor's under attack, so not very good that way. But if you don't have radar here, you're not going to be able to see anything coming into you, into basically attack Wake Island, besides sending basically wildcats on patrol, okay? And that has its own problems, because if the wildcats aren't there on the island and they're out, patrolling the sea, well, they're not there to shoot down enemy aircraft. And if they have to come back into land, there's a whole bunch of problems with this. Also, wildcats are not, patrol aircraft. You would want a Catalina flying boat if you're really going to do patrols. But again, the island is basically partly manned with a garrison that might be able to fight off a little invasion force at best. So they're working with what they got.
Several hours had passed as the island's defenders, feeling the tension and fear mount, looked across the sky for any sign of enemy aircraft. Eventually, almost precisely at noon, the roar of 36 Japanese twin-engined medium bombers filled the air as they approached through a rain squall. Anti-aircraft gunners struggled to match their range as Japanese bombs pulverized the station's facilities and destroyed all 8 Wildcats that remained on the ground. 23 men were.
And that's exactly why you have radar to give you a little heads up to get the planes off of the ground, okay? And the only only planes that survive were the ones on patrol, but they're going to have to come back, and when they come back, they're going to be out of fuel, so they're really going to have no choice but to land in a cratered runway.
Killed, mainly air personnel. From December 8, Wake Island was subjected to almost daily air raids, though not as severe as the first. The 4 remaining Wildcats, assisted by anti-aircraft fire, managed to shoot down 2 unescorted Japanese Mitsubishi G3M bombers the very next day. But this small victory only served to maintain the dwindling morale of the American soldiers as the attacks continued unabated. After 3 days of air bombardments, early on the 11th of December, a Japanese invasion fleet under Rear Admiral Kajioka was spotted on the horizon by the island lookouts. It would seem that the struggle for the Wake Atoll was about to enter its decisive phase. 3 light cruisers, 6 destroyers, and 2 troop transports arrived off Wake Island and closed the distance to the beaches with purpose. Japanese artillery boomed as the task force steamed along the coast, but the island's defenses remained silent. Admiral Kajioka, probably being encouraged by the bomber crew's optimistic reports, ordered his ships to close the distance further and continue the artillery barrage.
Now, that's actually pretty smart by the commanders defending the island, not open fire just yet. Now, you may be like, why don't they just open fire when they see them? Like, well, there's a reason for it. It's because if you don't show yourself, so for example, if you're not shooting, they don't know that one, the guns are still online. They would have thought the guns were knocked out by the aircraft raid. So that's a possibility. 2, if you don't shoot, they don't know the gun is there and active, and they don't know how to target it. So if you started opening fire well before your gun was actually in effective range, they could bombard the gun. So they're waiting until they're really close, probably, and then will open fire on the fleet because the fleet thinks the guns are down.
The Japanese distance to the beach steadily decreased as Kajioka's ships shelled the shoreline, destroying some civilian buildings but inflicting no damage to the island's defensive encampments. Major Devereaux, commanding the Marine Corps, patiently waited. He was aware of the shortcomings of his 5-inch coastal guns and ordered to hold fire until the Japanese ships drew closer, virtually into point-blank range. At last, the American batteries answered, and an initial salvo scored first hits on the Yubari, much to Kajioka's surprise. The Japanese admiral realized he'd been lured into a trap and was forced to immediately retreat to a safer range, hoping to avoid serious losses.
Now, this is what coastal guns are really good at, okay? Now, these 5-inch guns, these are destroyer guns. So just to put it in perspective, these are like destroyer and less guns. So they have to get close to do damage. And the Japanese fleet kindly obliged and got close. And when the Americans started opening fire, since it's a stationary position and not rocking back and forth, their accuracy is pretty good at that close range, which will start inflicting damage to the Japanese fleet, which is why they have to get the hell out of there.
But accurate fire from the coastal guns soon yielded significant results. Some of the American shells struck the aft torpedo mounts on one of the destroyers, causing a large explosion on board, tearing the ship in two. Within the next few minutes, the Hayate was enveloped by the waves along with her crew of 168 men. Yet the bad news did not end for Admiral Kajioka. In that time, the 4 Wildcats took off from the airstrip and joined the fray, pouncing on the retreating Japanese vessels. Initially, the American aircraft dealt minimal damage to the cruisers, but soon, one of their bombs exploded on the Kisaragi, another destroyer, by chance igniting her depth charges. The chain of explosions that followed ripped the Japanese ship apart, and just like the Hayate minutes earlier, the Kisaragi went under. A further 157 sailors were killed.
So this garrison is doing pretty well, as you can quite imagine, sinking 2 destroyers. And again, they're very minimally manned. Like this is again, the commander wanted to quadruple the size of the garrison. Imagine if a garrison had 2,000 troops here and was upgraded with even more coastal defenses. It could really pose a serious threat. But even what they have right now, they're doing pretty well. Sinking 2 destroyers, that's better than what I thought this garrison was going to be able to do here. And you can see that having fighter aircraft or any aircraft whatsoever on the island is very useful, even though they lost 8.
At the loss of 2 Wildcats, the US defenders managed to repel the invasion, sinking 2 destroyers and damaging several other ships. It was the first tactical defeat of the Japanese Navy in World War II, giving hope to all Americans after the disastrous attack on Pearl Harbor. But for the defenders on Wake Island, it was but the first round. Japanese air raids continued for the next 12 days. A constant state of vigilance drew a significant toll on the Marines, as they had to remain at their gun positions around the clock. With little respite between Japanese bombardments, Wake Island was not left entirely to its own fate, as a relief force dispatched from Hawaii was already on the move. Yet by 22 December, it was still far away from the atoll.
Now, that's a fleet carrier, USS Saratoga, that many people don't actually know about. Again, I should probably really do a video on what the U.S. fleet looked like after Pearl Harbor, so like January of 1942, because it'd be pretty interesting. So the San Francisco, I believe, is a cruiser, and the Minneapolis and Astoria, I'm not sure. But as I said, the relief force is already departing to Wake Island. But the problem is, look at where Wake Island is. It is basically by itself out there. Not to mention that, our actual territory of Guam was taken over, where my friend actually is from. That's over here. You can see that Guam was immediately taken over. It actually has a significant population. We're talking like 10,000 up to 100,000, I think, today. But it was pretty significant population that and a territory of the United States that we lost. Okay, it's not like Wake Island and all these other islands that are basically uninhabited. Now, this one, Guam was, and as you can see, Wake is basically by itself. And strategically, it's kind of important if you want to launch anything here, but it's going to be hard to resupply the base, unlike the other atolls that basically form a perimeter around Pearl Harbor.
All the while, the situation on Wake grew increasingly dire. The 2 last Wildcat fighters were lost in dogfights with a new threat, Japanese carrier-based Zeros, which complemented the waves of bombers. This could only mean that another invasion was but hours away. Indeed, early in the morning of the very next day, Admiral Kajioka's task force returned, but this time he was reinforced by 2 fleet carriers and several other heavier warships. 2 old destroyers were ran aground to allow the almost 2,000-strong Japanese unit to land on the beach. Soon a desperate battle was fought across the island, as the wary defenders struggled to hold their ground against the numerically superior enemy. After hours of desperate infantry combat, shrinking the defense lines to a couple of strong points, Commander Cunningham, seeing that further resistance was futile, ordered his men to lay down their weapons.
This is an important thing. The Japanese basically sacrifice 2 destroyers. When you run them aground, you're doing severe damage to the destroyer. It's not going to be like let's just get that thing back in the fight. No, that's basically sacrificing 2 destroyers to take this island. So basically, you have a kill count of almost 4. So 2 destroyers completely gone, and 2 out of the war for a long time while they have to be repaired. And the commander surrendered. Okay, now you have to keep in mind that again, many Americans didn't know. Basically, no one knew. Well, let's just exclude China for a bit here. The Western powers didn't know how POWs would be treated, okay, by the Japanese on their side. And they will soon find out that it is not very well. So, again, that's why they didn't fight to the death here. And, it's also in the very beginning of the war. I mean, what else are they going to do? I mean, they could die to a man, but...
After 15 days of air raids and 2 invasions later, the Imperial Japanese Navy finally captured the US outpost on Wake Island, but at a high cost. They had to sacrifice 4 warships, more than 20 bombers, and just short of 1,000 soldiers to overcome the fierce island's defenders, who lost just over 100 American and Guamanian men. The survivors became prisoners of war, 98 of whom were to be used on the island as forced labor. The rest were evacuated to camps in Japan and China. The gallant stand of the Wake Island defenders, though ultimately forced to yield, was one of the sparse bright points for the United States during the first gloomy weeks of the war. Their unbending will served as a rare morale boost to all American soldiers scattered on the Pacific Ocean theater, in the dark, bitter days of early 1942.
And that's a very key point. They did definitely boost the morale of the United States, even though they were taken out. They did significantly more damage than what basically it took the Japanese a significant amount of resources to take an island that wasn't very important to the United States. Okay, being very honest about that, and it took heavy casualties doing so. And disproportionately, they also lost a lot of resources trying to keep taking this island compared to the United States. So, again, Wake Island is something to be remembered.
Once again, a big thank you to War Thunder for sponsoring this video. Remember to hit
All right, so that's gonna wrap this up, and then we'll go to talking about this other stuff. So if you want to stick around for this, so number one, a popular legend has it that after beating off the initial attacks, the defenders sent back the message, "Send us more Japs" to Pearl Harbor in response to if they need anything. Though the phrase was picked up by American propaganda, in fact, "Send us" and "more Japs" were phrases at the beginning and end of an authenticated message to confuse Japanese codebreakers. Oh, there you go. Then two, Wake Island was held in Japanese hands for the rest of the war. That's important to remember. It was also garrisoned with more than 4,000 troops and reinforced with solid fortifications. Yet the U.S. Navy didn't ever attempt to storm it, rather concentrating on periodic bombardments, cutting it off from supply. Yeah, it's basically by itself, and it's not like a speed it's a speed bump. Okay, the United States didn't actually, I don't think, took back Guam until around 44 or 45, and that was a territory with a significant population of United States citizens that we well had to get back. And yeah, again, you could just bypass Wake because again, it's basically in the middle of nowhere. And then lastly, a relief force comprising of 3 heavy cruisers and the USS Saratoga fleet carrier under the command of Admiral Frank Blackjack Fletcher was sent to reinforce the defenders on Wake on December 15th. Yet upon the Japanese landings on December 23rd, the relief force was called back to Pearl Harbor, a decision that sparked a considerable outrage on board the USS Saratoga because, again, you don't like leaving people, behind. And I get the sentiment of the crew, wanting to go help their American brothers, but again, what are you? You have to retake the island and basically fight a fleet battle, and that's not with that force. You're not going to win that. So, all right. Hope you guys like that, and I'll put a video up there if you want to check out some other stuff. All right. See people later.